Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Chet. Today's daf is dedicated by Rona Fink in memory of her brother Elliot Laxter, Yisrael Tzvi ben Chaim Zichrono Lebracha, his yurtzeit, and by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of the engagement of her daughter Talia Sturman to David Wertentile. Shirbus Machop Yisrael, Mazal Tov. Okay, we're going to start with the very bottom of Zayin Amud Bet. We were learning about the idea of using a candle, and we've brought all those verses where we learned Mitzia from Chipus, right? We started with finding things, searching for things, etc. I saw in one of our Hadran groups, somebody posted yesterday a really great connection. They said that there's this idea of how we put out these 10 crumbs before, right, for Badika Chametz, and it's kind of strange because we're searching for something and we know exactly. And normally you search for something you don't know where it is, and you're searching for something that you know exactly where it is, so it's kind of funny. But she said it was an interesting comparison to the idea of Yosef checking for, in the brothers, he knew exactly where to find it, that there's this idea about, it was kind of a pretend search. Anyway, I thought it was a great connection. I don't know what to make of it, but it's a really interesting connection. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, now we're going to start with a Braita, which is very similar. They're going to quote all the same verses about showing that you have to do it with a candle. However, the beginning is going to be a little different. They're going to get into what kind of light can you not use for checking for chametz. Tanu Rabbanit. Ein bodkin, again, the very last line of Zayin Amud Bet. Ein bodkin lo le'or hama, you cannot use sunlight. V'lo le'or levana, not the light of the moon. V'lo le'or ha'avuka, not the light of a torch. Ela le'or haner, only light of a candle. Why? Because that's the best way to check. Okay, now one might argue with this, and we're going to see a little bit about why not these other cases, it doesn't exactly say why not, only we're going to compare to a torch. And why not a torch? You would think a torch is better light, but we'll get to that soon. The Braita continues, and this I'm not going to explain again because we already explained this in yesterday's daf. Even though it doesn't appear explicitly in the Pesukim, there's a reference to it. You can't find leaven in your house for 7 days. You shouldn't find. Right? Then we see again, lo yimatzeh, and then it says by Yosef yechapes bagadol echel ve'omer ba'eta yechapes et Yerushalayim b'neirot. They don't even quote the whole pasuk where it talks about, and he finds it, and then ba'eta yechapes Yerushalayim b'neirot, right? That God is going to search Yerushalayim by candlelight to find the sinners. Ve'omer ner Hashem nishmat adam chofes kol chadrei baten. And here you see that you can search with one single candle. So now they're going to analyze the beginning of this Braita and talk about the other types of light. So they ask here, Hi ora chama hechidami. Where exactly is it that you cannot check with sunlight? Because think about it. In those days, the assumption was that in your house, there's really not a lot of sunlight. So it's probably not in your house. They're saying don't check with sunlight. So where exactly are you checking outside? And here again, we're going to see a very strong comparison to Eruvin. They're going to talk about the chatzer, the courtyard, the achsadra, the portico, which was that roofed structure without walls. They're going to talk about different areas like that. So chatzer, inema bechatzer, if we're going to say that you're talking about in the courtyard, and we don't want you to be checking in the courtyard with sunlight, well, can't possibly be talking about that. Why? Didn't Rava say, you don't need to check in the courtyard because the ravens fly there. What's the relevance? Well, what do ravens do? They eat everything. So if we leave chametz in the courtyard, we can assume that the ravens ate it up, okay? And this is something we're going to come up with later about animals dragging food, and that's going to be the topic of tomorrow's shiur, a little bit today, but more tomorrow. So you can assume, since the ravens get there all the time, we can assume you don't even need to check at all. So your own courtyard doesn't need bedika. Elabach sadra, well, maybe we're talking about a covered area where it's less likely the ravens are going to come in because it is covered, even though it's open. Good question whether that really prevents the birds from getting in or not, but the Gemara seems to think so. But even that, ha'amarava achsadra le'ora nivdeket. Okay, the first one we said the chatzar doesn't even need to be checked. But the achsadra does need checking, but it says, Rava says that you can check it with sunlight. Because why is that? Because it's very easy to get into the portico with the sunlight comes in so strongly that it lights it up fully, and it's very easy to check. First of all, one thing you don't have in achsadra is corners and areas that are harder to find. So sunlight definitely works for this. So it can't be that lo le'or hachama is talking about an achsadra. So lo tzricha la'aruba de b'cheder. We must be talking about a skylight, right, where there's kind of this window in the roof, and through that the light comes down, and then it's very light, right? We all know if you have a skylight, the whole idea is to bring in lots of light. Then you're going to have lots more sunlight, and it really will work. And then it's telling you no. But then they say, wait a minute, udehecha, but where exactly? Where are you checking using this sunlight? If you're going to say exactly under the skylight where the sun comes in very clearly, in that case, the sunlight should be enough. It should be just like the achsadra. So therefore, you can't be talking about that. They finally conclude it must be talking about on the sides of where the skylight comes in. In other words, right, you're directly in view of where the sun shines in, you can use the sunlight. But anywhere on the sides of that, you can't use the sunlight. And that must be what they're talking about, not using sunlight. Now they're going to talk about why not a torch. Vavukalo, and here they're going to make a pitch for why one should use a torch, or you would think one would. Vahama Rava, again, they're quoting Rava. Mai dechtiv v'noga ke'ortia, karnayim miyado lo, v'sham chavyon uzo. This is a verse from Chavakuk. And it's talking about God shining his light on the tzaddikim, on the righteous people. Karnayim, right, noga ke'ortia, the bright light will shine like a light. Karnayim yadotia, the rays will come out of his hands. V'sham chavyon uzo, and that's where the strength of God is hidden. I don't know exactly what that means, but they're going to darshan this pasuk is saying, Lemat tzaddikim domim b'fnei hashchina, kiner b'fnei havuka. They darshan this pasuk to say that the tzaddikim are like a candle compared to the torch of God, which obviously shows that a torch is much brighter and better. Ve'amar Rava, and furthermore, Rava said, and I assume you all know this halacha, avuka lahavdala mitzvah min hamuvchar. Why do havdalah candles made up of multiple wicks? It comes from this statement of Rava, that it's better, okay, here you see, by the way, it's better to do the mitzvah, which means you really could do havdalah with one candle if you're stuck, but it's better to do havdalah with a thicker wick, right, with a double wick, with a torch. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, now the question is going to be, so why don't we use a torch for B'dika Chametz? We're now going to have 4 answers, which interesting is that in many of the Sifrei Halacha, only 2 of these are mentioned, maybe because they're the more convincing ones, number 1 and number 3. We're going to see. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, in some of the Sifrei Halacha, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, ze yachol lachniso l'chorinu l'stakim, v'ze eno yachol lachniso l'chorinu l'stakim. We talked about this before. If you take a candle, a single candle, you can get it into the corners and the cracks and crevices, whereas you can't do that when you're doing, when you have a torch. You can't put it, right? It's too big to go into corners or little cracks. Or holes, which we're going to get to later today, about if you have a hole in a wall, holin or holes. Okay, we'll get to that. Rav Zvi Amar, ze oro lefanav, ze oro lacharav. Okay, you imagine people in a tunnel, dark tunnel. The first person's holding a torch. Now, who benefits the most from the light of the torch? Why do you use a torch? Because it helps the people behind you. Right nowadays, you might go in with your telephone and use your flashlight, and that usually only helps the person in front. It doesn't really help the people behind you. But if you use a big torch, it's very good for the people behind you. What's the problem? For the first person, it's a little bit blinding. So therefore, they say the torch helps oro la'acharav. It helps the people behind you. But the candle helps lefanav. A candle is much smaller. It doesn't blind you, the light of the candle, and therefore it's really helping the people in front of you. And that's why we're going to say that it helps in front of you. Oh, by the way, I see a question in the chat, and I forgot to mention this. The portico, okay, the issue of the portico, of checking the portico during the day, what are we talking about? Because isn't B'dika at night? So what do we mean? So it's actually, there's a debate. It's very interesting. There's a debate about when we're referring to. Are we referring to on the 13th before that you're allowed to check at the day of the 13th before using natural light? Some people say that. Other people say, no, what we're talking about is if you forgot to check your portico. Let's say, by the way, this would be a good, I'll give you another practical example. This sounds like if you have a pergola outside your house, that's basically like this achsadra. It would sound like you have to do b'dika chametz there, okay, according to this Gemara. So basically what they're saying is, let's say you checked your whole house and you forgot to check your achsadra, then on the 14th during the day, you're allowed to use sunlight to check it. So there's a debate whether we mean before or whether we mean after, okay, in the event that you forgot, okay, and then according to that, it's almost like it's b'di'evet, If you're stuck, then you can use the sunlight, because obviously a candle's not going to help you during the day. So there's a debate about how to understand this. So thank you for asking, Gita. I forgot to mention that. Okay, going back now. And also the issue is, as Ellie points out, that the 14th of the month, the moon is very full. And that's why you might have thought you could use the light of the moon. Okay, so now we're still in our questions about what's the difference. So we had number one, the difference is a torch can't get into the cracks and crevices. The torch also blinds, and it's harder to see in front of you with it. Rav Papa Amar, high bayit, v'high low bayit. When you're holding a torch, it's a little bit scary. There's a lot of fire there. So you're nervous. So you want to kind of quickly finish your bedika if you're going to do it with a torch, whereas you're not really scared holding a candle. Ravina Amar, high mashach nahora, v'high miktaf iktufe. In the candle, the light remains usually pretty stable, but in a torch, it flickers, it fluctuates on and off, on and off. And that's that, because of that, it's not so good for doing this. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but that's what the Gemara says here. And that's possibly why they really only quote the first and the third, because I think it's debatable whether a torch is really necessarily blinding and also whether it flickers more than a candle. We're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, if it's a place where you don't bring chametz, you don't have to check there. So now they want to say, why didn't it just say makom she'em machnisim? Why does it say kol makom? Every time they always darshan, right? Any words like all places. Why all? What does that add? Kol makom latuye mai. What does it come to include? Latuye hadetanu Rabbanan. It comes to include all these cases that are mentioned in a Braita. And here we go. Chorei beit ha'elyonim chorei bayit ha'elyonim va'tachtonim. Holes in a house, okay, this is if you have a wall with holes inside that are high up or low down, which again, this goes back to Eruvin. Anything too high or too low, people just don't use. So if it's very high or very low, people don't use it. Therefore, you don't need to check there because it's very unlikely there's any chametz there. V'gag hayitzia v'gag hamigdal. The roof okay, now we're assuming we're talking about, sometimes you have a little room in the roof and the roof is sloped. So there's almost no way to get into that room. It's very uncomfortable. So that's a good example of a place you wouldn't have to check because people don't really go there. Or Gag Hamigdal, the roof of a very tall building. Okay, well, again, we're likely not going to go there. Now you might tell me, based on Eruvin, people didn't use their roofs in general at all. So it should be any roof. And in fact, some people have the girsa that says Gag v'hayitzia as two separate things. They mean the roof and some sort of annexed area. So it's possible that any roof maybe doesn't need bedika according to that. V'refet bakar v'lulin. Okay, what about refet, a place where the animals live, okay, or the lul where the chickens live? So now there you don't have to do bedika. Why? This is a different reason. This is like the ravens, because they're going to eat anything you leave there. So we assume they've gotten rid of everything. I see their art wrote, what about little kids putting chametz in little holes? So they seem to not really be worried about that. Okay. Umatbein v'otzrot yayin. Now we start getting to all sorts of storage houses. So we're going to learn throughout the sugya some of the reality of their times and how they stored their food without refrigeration, freezers, right? They store their food in these storage areas. And it seems like they didn't put everything together. They had special place for their oil, special place for their wine. And we're going to learn all sorts of other storage houses that they had in addition. We'll get to that later. So matbein, where they kept their tevin, I guess their straw, their hay. Otzrot yayin, otzrot shemen, ein tzrichim bedika. Okay. Generally, people do not bring chametz here, and therefore you don't need to check. Now, obviously, you might be remembering the first Mishnah where it said you have to check 2 rows in the martef in the wine cellar. So we'll get back to this. According to this source, it sounds like you don't need to check a place where there's wine, a wine cellar. Rashba gomer mitah choleket betoch habayit umapseket tzricha bedika. Normally, your bed is up against a wall, right? It's the best way to kind of set up a room is to stick the bed in the corner, especially if you have a small room. It takes up the least amount of space. But it seems that in their day, sometimes they use the bed and they put it in the middle of the room to split the room in half. Imagine there's 2 people sharing a room. So they put the bed in the middle so that, you have your half, I have my half. I'm not sure if they were as concerned as we are nowadays about everybody having their own space, but maybe for other reasons they wanted to split the room and they put the bed in the middle. Now there's 2 assumptions about this bed. Number 1, it's in the middle of the room. Once it's in the middle of the room, it's more accessible to get under the bed. If the bed is off in the corner, you only have really one access point to the bed and maybe you'll use the underneath part less. Number 2, It's also there because it's going to be an assumption that this is a higher type of bed because it was used as a separator, maybe because of that it was higher, which means that there's more space under the bed to store things, which again will make it more likely that you're storing things under the bed. So according to Rashbag, if you have this bed that splits your room, then you have to do bedika underneath because it's likely you used it for chametz. Now so we have, on the beginning, we had all the holes in the wall and the places where the animals are, where they're going to eat it, and all sorts of spaces that you don't ever really use. You don't have to do bedika, like the osrot yayin, osrot shemen. And then we have this mita of Rashbag. Now we're going to bring a source that contradicts two aspects of this braita. Uriminu. Chor sheben adam lechavero. Again, we have a wall. Let's say we have a shared wall. Okay, this wall is my house on this side, your house on that side. And ze bodek ab makom she'ado magat, v'ze bodek ab makom she'ado magat. Now, what's the problem? It's a very thick wall. I can't get my hand all the way in the wall. It also depends how big the hole is. So I can't get my hand all the way through the hole. I go as far as I can. You go as far as you can. And if there's some space in the middle that we can't access, so hashar mevatlo belibo. The rest, you basically nullify whatever you say. If there's any chametz in there, it's null and void. Now, by the way, I just said you say. It's a little bit tricky whether you say or not. And I didn't mention this in yesterday's shiur, but when we talked about mevatzlo b'libo, like that student in the yeshiva who remembers that he has a dough rising at home, and it says mevatzlo b'libo, there's a debate when we say mevatzlo b'libo, and this is something that comes up all over the Gemara when we talk about somebody doing something with their thoughts. It's always a debate. Do we mean that they actually said it in words and they just call it b'libo, because kind of you could say it to yourself, let's say, or does it mean just thinking it is sufficient? And there's a debate that goes all through Shas. I'll give you another example. Pigul, which is if you're bringing a sacrifice and you have, while the Kohen is sacrificing it, he thinks, I'm going to eat this in a time that's not allowed, or I'm going to burn it on the Mizbeach in the wrong time or in the wrong place or something like that. He messes up the korban. And there's a big debate. Is it just thinking, or does he actually have to say it in order for it to be considered pigul? So it's the same debate here, which is mevatzlo b'libo really just in your heart, or do you actually have to express it? That's a side machloket. In any case, what do you see here? Here you have a hole in the wall and somebody's checking it. You have to check it. So how could it be that before they said no and here they said yes? Next, Rabbi Shimon, the Braita continues here. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer mita choleket b'toch habayit. Now you would think, we said before, according to Rashbag, mita choleket b'toch habayit, you have to check underneath. But here it says, if there's wood and rocks underneath it, and it splits the room in half, you don't need a check. So how could that be? We just said you do. So the Gemara says, kasha mita mita, kasha cholin cholin. We have a contradiction both about the bed and about the holes in the wall. So now they say, cholin a cholin lo kasha. So let's start with the holes in the wall. We can very easily answer this. We said in the first source, it said very explicitly, holes that are very high up or very low down. So obviously the second braita is talking about holes that are in the middle at an average height that a person would regularly put items into. Mita lo kasha, had midalia, had mitatai. It depends how high the bed is. If the bed is very high, then we're going to assume you use it to store things underneath. If the bed is lower, again, it's a little bit strange because the bed does have things underneath. It says eitzim v'avanim, but I assume it only has room for that and you're not going to be putting anything else if it's low down. Now moving on. So that was one braita that contradicted two parts of that other braita. Now we're going to bring other braitot, other sources from the Tannaitic times that contradict the other parts of this braita. So it said, otzrot yain ein sarich b'dika. You don't need to check in the wine cellar. But then it says, Vahatanya, it says in a different braita, Otzrot yain tzarich b'dika. You have to check the wine cellar. Otzrot shemen ein tzarich b'dika. But you don't have to check where you keep your oil. So, hacha b'mayaskinam b'mistapek. There's two different kinds of wine cellars. There's wine cellar, or it's not that there's different kinds, but the question is, are you likely to come down to the wine cellar in the middle of the meal, or likely send your shamash? In those days, people had someone who was kind of serving them their meals, at least if you were wealthy. Probably if you had a wine cellar, you were wealthy. So the idea being that if in the middle of the meal, you might send him down to get something, well, then he might go down with chametz in his hand, and then you have to check your wine cellar. But if it's not a cellar where you ever go down during the meal, then you don't have to worry about it. So now they say, wait a minute. If that's already what you're discussing and that's your answer, Shem and Nami, you could say the exact same thing. There could be sometimes where you might need oil in the middle of the meal. So if it's a case where sometimes you send the shamash to get more oil, then also you'd have to worry. There'd be chametz there. Why do we say you don't need to do bedika? So they say, and this is very interesting, you'll probably agree with this, they say shemen yesh kevel achila, yain ein kevel l'shtiya. What does that mean? This means oil, there's generally a certain amount of oil people use during the meal. You don't generally need more. The shamash knows just about how much oil. You're not going to err so much. But when it comes to wine, sometimes people drink wine and then they open another bottle and another bottle and another bottle and they get carried away and they send the shamash, oh, we need another bottle, we need more wine, we need more wine. So it's it's much harder for him to gauge before the meal starts how much wine the people are actually going to need. And therefore wine is much more likely that he'll go there in the middle of the meal. And that's what we're going to talk about in the continuation here. Amrav Chista, before we get there, I skipped a line. Tane Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia now says, Asu otzrot shechar bebavel ka otzrot yain be'eretz Yisrael b'mistapek. This is an interesting historical point, which is, it seems clear that the way they drank wine in Israel was comparable to the way they drank beer in Babylonia. Okay, remember, Israel is a place where lots of grapes grow, but apparently in Babylonia, no. And instead of having wine, they had beer. Because of that, they say their beer was like the wine in Israel, meaning that if they would get carried away, then they would go down to their beer cellar and get beer in the middle of the meal. So therefore it would be the same as the wine. Now you might say beer is chametz, which I see, Gita, you asked, but they must be talking about date beer or fig beer. There was beer in those days that was made with other things that wasn't chametz. Okay, you'd have to say that, otherwise it obviously makes no sense. Amar Rav Chista, Bei Dagim ein tzarich b'dika. Now we find out about all kind of other storage houses. They had a storage area where they kept fish. Okay, they obviously didn't keep fresh fish because those would spoil. They didn't have refrigeration, but they salted the fish. They put it in a brine, right? And that would keep the fish for a long time. So you don't have to check there. Okay, Vahatanya, wait a minute. It says, Nabraita tzrichim b'dika. So we have this country, right? Rav Chista says they don't need, but yet there's a Tanaitic source that says they do. Lokashia habarav rabe habazutre. Depends how big the fish are. If it's big fish, then the assumption is the shamash knows exactly how much to bring in the beginning of the meal. He's not going to go get another big fish. But if they use, if they have small fish, then it's very likely that the small fish, they came and they would come and take more because, you might need one or two more, or three more, they're very little. So then it was more likely. Amar Rabba Bar Huna, Bei Milche Ubei Kire Tzarich B'dika. The storage house of salt or the storage house of candles, that was a place where you would need bedika, right? It's funny, you think of our cabinets now, we put lots of things. It sounds like they had a cabinet with salt in it. They had it, right? Whether it's a cabinet or whether it's a house, a whole area, it's tough to know exactly. But those things need bedika because those are things in the middle of a meal. You might need salt. You might need more candles because, again, they ate by candlelight. They ate always at night. We're going to get to that sugya soon about the time of day that people ate. So all that, right, needs bedika. Amar Papa, Beit Sive, Ubeit Mare, Tzarich bedika. The house where they kept all the wood. Again, you might need a fire to go in the middle of the meal, whether to cook up your food or more likely to keep you warm. Ubeit Mare, or the house where they kept the dates. Again, you might want more dates in the middle of your meal, and therefore it needs bedika. Tana. Okay, now we're moving on to another topic, which is you don't make a person put his hand inside holes or inside cracks to check because of sakana, because of danger. We're now going to have two explanations. It'll take a little while till we get to the second, but what exact danger are we discussing? My sakana. What is the danger? Maybe you're worried there's a scorpion in the hole, right? There could be all sorts of creatures in there. If you're nervous that you're going to put your hand into the hole, right, like Rabbi Akiva's daughter, Yafeh, so you might put your hand in the hole and a scorpion will bite you. Well, if that's the case, well, then how exactly are you using this hole? Obviously, it must be only a hole that you're using, and that's why you have to check it. So you wouldn't be using it if you're worried about scorpions. So they say, no, really, it could be scorpions. And what's the case? Lo tzricha de nafal. Okay, there's two ways to understand this. Nafal could mean that things fell on top of it, kind of like a mapolet, which we're going to see in a minute. And then you want to kind of check the holes in the pile of rubble to see. Or maybe it means that something fell into the hole. And if something fell into the hole, you didn't put it there on purpose, but it fell in on its own. And now you have to check because maybe it's still there. So inafal lama lebedika. But wait a minute. If it fell, let's say it falls into a place. Okay, again, either we're talking about a mapolet, and then the comparison is very clear, where like there's a avalanche type thing, something piles up on top of it. Or maybe they mean if it fell and you're scared that there's a scorpion in there, you're certainly never going to go and access that chametz. Now, if you're not going to access that chametz, what do we know? And we're going to see now from the mapolet case. Inafal lama lebedika. You don't even need to check. The Hadran, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? If there's an avalanche, a ton of rocks fall, a wall collapses and falls on top of chametz, and you can't get under all that rubble, well, you obviously don't need to do bedika there because that chametz is as if it's destroyed because it's so inaccessible. So either if it fell into a hole where there's likelihood of scorpions, you're never going to actually use it. So you don't have to do bedika. It's like it's mivo'al. Or a pile of stuff fell on top of it, and again, you're not going to access it. So what do they answer? No, there's a difference between the mapola case and this case. Hatam she'ena kelev yachol lechapes acharav. Hachak shekelev yachol lechapes acharav. It depends. Okay, so now again, if it's in a hole, we can say, well, the hole might not be accessible by you because you're scared of a scorpion, but a dog might go in there and try to take it out, in which case the dog could take it out, and then you'll have a problem of chametz around. Or if it's a pile, whereas the pile of rubble, for sure not. Or if we're talking about that something fell on top of it and it's under a pile, we'd have to say the pile is lower and then the mapolet case. The mapolet is there's a huge pile, which means the dog can never access it. But here we're talking about a lower pile, in which case if a dog could actually kind of rummage through and get to it, which then would be an issue. Okay, so those are possible ways of resolving this issue. And now we start entering a very interesting topic, which is, didn't Rabbi Elazar say shluchei mitzvah einan nizokin? It's a very famous line, which means if you're on your way to do a mitzvah, you're protected by God, right? What better protection could you have than being protected by God? So if that's the case, here you're doing b'dika chametz. Who cares if there's a scorpion inside? What kind of danger are you worried about? God's going to protect you from scorpions. Okay, right? We're all thinking, what do you mean? What, you're going to go into a place where there's scorpions? Just say, oh, well, God is protecting me, right? But the Gemara takes this at this point very seriously and says, hey, it says, how could it possibly be that you're involved in a mitzvah and you're worried about danger? No, there's no danger when it comes to mitzvah. So how's the Gemara going to answer? Amar Rav Ashi, Shema tovad lo machat va'ate li'iyune batra. Maybe you lost other things, right? Imagine I have a piano, okay? So, let's say I go to check behind my piano for chametz, but I know that I've also lost some other things in my house, and maybe there's some, like now that I'm moving the piano once a year, maybe something else fell behind there. So maybe I'm looking for something else in addition, which means I'm not fully doing a mitzvah because I'm also I'll use these words. It's like saying you have an ulterior motive. And if you have an ulterior motive, maybe you're not exactly doing a mitzvah. So they say, but that can't be the case. You are still considered doing a mitzvah, even if you have ulterior motives. How so? What, you think it's not a mitzvah? You're also checking for something else? Now the comparison is not exactly 100% comparable because here you're kind of doing two actions, checking for chametz and checking for a needle. But in this braita, you're doing one mitzvah, but you're doing it, what's similar about it is you're doing it for ulterior motives. The Hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita? Ha'omer, sela zol tzedakah. If you say, I'm giving this money for tzedakah, b'shvil she'yachye b'ni, o she'yeh ben olam haba. If you say, I'm giving this tzedakah, this charity, so that my son will live a long life, or so that I will get a share in the world to come, harei zeh tzadik gamur. You are a very righteous person. Rashi points out, by the way, bidavar zeh. You're only a tzaddik amor in this area. It doesn't mean you're a tzaddik amor. It doesn't give you, carte blanche to say, oh, I'm perfect. But this is totally fine, even though this is what we call shelo lishma, right? You're doing it for ulterior motives. And there's a big question about this because if you remember Pirkei Avot, what does it say in Pirkei Avot? You're not supposed to do mitzvot in order, right? And Tosfot quotes it if you want to look. First Tosfot on Chenem Abet. Don't be like slaves who worship their master just to get rewarded. So how do we deal with that? So Tosfot answers it one way, right? Because this is basically, that's what someone's doing. So Tosfot's answer is, depends how you do it. There's a way to say it and there's a way to say it. Okay, you can say let's say your son doesn't live, or let's say you don't get a portion of the world to come. Now, obviously, you don't know that till later, but let's say he would say, I'm sorry that I ever gave the charity. If you say that, that's like that you only want it for the reward. And if you find out, let's say you were to find out you're not going to get rewarded for this, you'll say, oh, too bad I did that mitzvah. I really didn't want to do it. But that's different than somebody saying, right, like our case, where you're doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah. You're also just doing something in addition, which where it comes to tzedakah, you're doing it because you want to give tzedakah, and you're happy if you get a positive result of, some reward from it also. Okay, but it's not that you're doing it specifically only for the reward. And that's how they distinguish between those cases. So now they say, but so if that's the case, it sounds like if you're doing it for ulterior motives, we say, that's fine. It shouldn't be a problem, just like with the tzedakah case. So how do we answer it? Dilma batar debadak ate li'iyuna batra. After you already checked for chametz, then what happens? Then you start looking for your needle. Now, this is I know, let's say you're looking for something, okay? I can give a more disgusting example, but when you're checking your kid's hair for lice, okay, if you've ever done this. So you're looking for nits and you're looking for bugs. Now, sometimes it's easier just to look for one and then the other. It's hard sometimes when you're looking at something very carefully to look for two things at once. So sorry for using a disgusting example, but that's what came into my head right now. But so it could be, think about a needle is much harder to find. I think that's why they took the example of a needle. So it's likely you could check for your chametz, and when you're finished there and you're still with your candle inside, you'll say, oh, let me see now if I can find the needle that I lost. And then at that point, you're no longer protected. So because of that, they say you don't need to do badika because, right, something might happen to you, and we no longer are considered a shluchei mitzvah because you're finished with your mitzvah. Okay, so we basically resolved that issue. Okay, we're going to come back to the shluchei mitzvah and anizokin. In fact, Daf Mishalehem this week is all about that. It'll come out tonight. You can see it, but it's all about this idea of shluchei mitzvah and anizokin, right? This is why people give shlich mitzvah money when they go on a trip, right? Someone's going somewhere, they say, oh, take money to give to tzedakah so that you'll be protected on the way. We all know that this doesn't always work, right? So that's also part of the problem. So we'll discuss it a little bit more later. So I'll leave it for right now as a question, kind of how do we resolve this with our world and our reality of, wait a minute, don't you have to take precautions? And why would you stick your hand into a place where there might be scorpions? And so we'll get there. So the first idea was that maybe the sakana is scorpions. Now they're going to say maybe the sakana is Gentiles. Maybe we're worried about Gentiles. Now, what about Gentiles? This reminds us again of Eruvin, about this concern about people who lived among Gentiles, and there were these Gentiles that were out to get them, or there was a likelihood of the Gentiles getting angry at them and maybe doing something. So let's see. So they're going to say, what's the issue? And it goes by Plemo, who was a Tana. We're going to see what he says. Ditanya. There's a Braita, and in this Braita, there's a debate. Let's say I have a shared wall, not with another Jew, like before, where we each put our hand in, but now I have a shared wall with a Gentile. According to Tanakama, you do the exact same thing you did if you live next to a Jew. You do your half, and he worries about his half. In this case, as a Gentile, doesn't have to worry about it. You do your half, wherever you can get. You stop there and you say, well, if there's still part on my half, if I couldn't get to my whole half, I'll nullify it on my own. Plemo amal, but he disagrees. He says, Kol atzmo eino bodek mipnei sakana. You don't check this wall at all because of the sakana. Okay, that didn't really help us. It just told us who's the Tana who says this. But now we have to figure out why. So my sakana, what exactly is this danger? Ine masakanat kshafim. If we're worried about dangers of witchcraft. Now, what's the witchcraft? You might have thought maybe the Gentile will put some witchcraft on me. No, that's not the concern. The concern is that if I start going into my hole and checking, the Gentile might see that I'm doing this or know that I'm doing this somehow, and he'll be nervous that I'm trying to put some spell on him. Now, what's going to happen if the Gentile thinks I'm putting a spell on him? He will likely, okay, again, go back to the mindset of the people in those days. He might likely come and kill me, right? This was, again, whether this was a real fear or maybe just a fear of the Jews that they were worried that, they'd be considered the scapegoats. And we see this all throughout history, right? That they'll get in trouble for this. So now we're going to see right, what exactly the concern is and why it's such a concern. So first of all, they say, wait a minute. If you're worried about that, if I go into this hole, I'm going to be suspected of witchcraft and maybe killed. Well, kiyash tamish, hechiyash tamish. Same question with the scorpion. How am I possibly using this hole in the first place? If there's a concern of witchcraft, then I'll never use that hole, in which case I don't need to do any bedika. So what do they answer? Hatam kiyash tamish yamama unahora. V'lo masikadate. Normally, when I use the hole, it's during daylight and it's without a candle. It's with regular light from the day. And they're not going to think anything of it if I put something in a hole in my wall. But ha-chalelya ushragahu. That's what am I doing now? It's dark. It's late at night. I take my candle. I put a candle in the hole. Nobody does that. They're going to think I'm crazy, right? They're going to say, what a weird thing you Jews are doing. There must be some sort of witchcraft going on, with a hole at night. Again, night was always a scary time, and there was always more of a fear of these things. Umasikadate. And then he's going to think that I'm doing witchcraft, and therefore we don't do bedika in that case, according to Plamo. Now, what's interesting is Tanakama thinks yes. Could be that they were coming from different realities, or again, so some people are more nervous type people and scared of all sorts of possibilities of things that might happen, whereas other people less so. So Plamo thought this was an issue. Tanakama didn't think this was an issue. So now they say again, but wait, aren't we all protected? So what do they answer? And here's a better answer than the first one, which is, where there's a big danger, it's a different story. Okay. And here, maybe they view this danger. It's interesting that they view this as more dangerous than the scorpions, right? You would think scorpions, maybe just the likelihood of a scorpion being there was less likely. But here, there was a big danger, according to Plamo anyway, not according to Tanakama. When there's a big danger, then you have to take precautions, and you can't just say, oh, shluchei mitzvah ein ani zokin. Oh, God will protect me. So now, how do we know this? And they're going to prove it from Shmuel. When Shmuel goes to anoint David to be the king, when Shaul was still the king, he's worried. He says, how am I supposed to go? God tells him, go. And he says, how can I go? He's going to kill me. He's going to find out what I'm on my way to. So Vayomer Hashem, take some meat with you and go say, I'm going to make a sacrifice, or, I'm going to have some meat together with Yishai, we're going to have a meal, and that's what the issue is. So basically, he says, what do you see from here? Shmuel was worried, even though he was on his way to do a mitzvah, and a huge mitzvah, right, to make David the king, and yet he was, he took precautions. So from here we learn, even though shluchei mitzvah ein ani zokin, you have to take your own precautions, especially if it's a big danger. So continuing along with this issue, they asked Rav the following question. So the students of the house of Rav that live out in the fields, can they come early at night or late, or early in the morning or late at night when it's kind of in between night and day? Lebei Rav, to go learn in the house of Rav. So obviously, what did Rav tell them? He wanted them all to learn. So he said, Amarlu nete, alai val tzavari. That's on me. I'll take responsibility for you. Okay, don't worry. Nezil mai, what about going home? Can they go home and not have to worry about it? And it's, yes, I understand on their way to do a mitzvah. What about on the way home? This is kind of like doctors, right? They can go to the hospital. Are they allowed to go home, right? So here it's different issue, but it's the same kind of thing. Yes, you're allowed to go. The whole question becomes also, can you go home? So Nezil mai, what about coming home? Amar lahu lo yadana. Fascinating. He says, I don't know. I don't know if you're protected. Makes sense. I mean, how would you know, right? This isn't the kind of thing we have an answer to. We know for sure. But Itmar, it was said, okay, according to Rabbi Elazar, there's another statement that says that he actually says on the way there and on the way back. Kiman, who holds like this? Ki Aitana Detanya, as it says in the following, Braita Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Klapesha Amra Torah, Velo Yachmod Ishet Artsecha, Melamed Shte Poratcha Ro'e Be'efer Ve'en Chaya Mezikata, Tarnagolatcha Minakeret Ba'ashpa Ve'en Chuda Mezikata. Okay, let's stop for a minute. This is a very interesting verse. I'm not sure if you've ever paid attention to it. It says in Shmot Lamed Daled, chapter 34, pasuk 24, Ki orish goyim mipanecha, when you conquer the non-Jews, v'herchavti et gvulecha, and I make your boundaries wide, v'lo yachmod ish et artzecha ba'alotcha lirot et pnei Hashem Elokecha shalosh pamim b'shana. When you go up to Aliyah LaRegel, no one's going to try to take away your stuff. Imagine, right? I don't know if you ever thought about this, but you're going on Aliyah LaRegel, right? If nowadays I would leave my house, what would I do? I'd lock it up. I'd put the alarm on. I'm going away for a while. Nowadays, I'll give you another good example. When people go to a funeral for a family member, now there's posters up all around the city that there's a funeral at this and this hour of this family, and the shiva is going to be at their house, right? So everybody knows All the robbers out there know exactly that no one's going to be home at that house. And many people actually hire someone to sit in their house so that robbers don't come. So imagine all the Jews going up on Aliyah L'Regel, and they're leaving behind their livestock, right? They don't bring everything with them. They can't possibly. And they're leaving behind all their stuff. How could it be that no one's going to steal it? So the Torah promises, don't worry, you'll be protected, okay? And now they say, right, and not only that, but there's wild animals around who might eat your animals, okay? So they say, this pasuk teaches you that your para is going to graze and no one's going to harm it, and your tarnagolim, your roosters are going to be there, and they're going to put around in the garbage, and the chulda is not going to attack it. And this is really kavachomer. Uma elu shedarkan lizok ena nizokin. These are very likely, they're open to danger, right? It's very likely some wild animal is going to come and attack them, and yet they won't. So b'nei adam she'en darkan lizok, we can protect ourselves better. Allah hakama v'kama, all the more so we're going to be protected. So this teaches you shluchei mitzvah ena nizokin. Ainli ala b'halicha. Okay, so that teaches you on the way to the mitzvah. But b'chazara minayin, how do we know when we're coming back? Talmud Lomar, it says in a different verse in Sefer Dvarim, Pasuk Perek Tet Zayin, Ufanita, also in the context of going to do the Korban Pesach, Upanita baboker v'alachta lo alecha. In the morning, you will go home. So what do they learn from this? Right, to your tents. This means you're going to go home and find your tent intact the way it was, the way you left it. So here you see, even on the way home. So now they say, wait a minute. What do you need the beginning part for? If you're going to come home and everything's going to be intact, you don't need the first part of the verse to teach you that then. You get it from the end. So they say, fine, let's explain the first part a different way. It comes to teach us this halacha of Rabbi Ami, that a very interesting halacha. I don't know enough about it, but according to him, and we don't paskin this way, but only people who have land are chayav and aliyah l'regel, not everybody. And they learn that from lo yachmod adam et artzecha, your land. When you go on aliyah l'regel, it only refers to people who have land. Because of a Mishnah in Peah where it mentions anyone who doesn't have land is exempt from the following mitzvot, and it doesn't mention aliyah l'regel, so it seems to, because based on that, they paskin against him. Amar Rabbi Avan, Bar Rav Adam, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, mipnei ma, since we're talking about aliyah l'regel, they now talk about mipnei ma ein perot ginosar b'Yerushalayim. Why are the best fruits found in Ginosar? They're not, which is near the Kinneret. They're not found in Yerushalayim. Now you would think Yerushalayim, Ir Kodesh, it's the most special city. Why wouldn't it have the best of the best? And maybe there's a good way to explain to people, right? If you think Yerushalayim is the best city and yet it doesn't have all these great things, maybe it's not the best city. So they're saying there's a reason for it. People might say, oh, if I had not, right? If I just came, forget Aliyah l'Regel. I just want to go there for the fruits. This is back to what we talked about before, about going for the wrong reasons. You know, people would say that would be enough. And then it would be that they went up on the Aliyah l'Regel for the wrong reasons. Kayotsebo, same thing. Why aren't the hot springs of Tiberia in Jerusalem? Same idea. Okay, now we're finally getting to the Shtei Shurot Martef. So the first problem, which we discussed when we saw the Mishnah, was where did they even get to the Martef? We weren't talking about a Martef, a wine cellar, and they do it as if we know what they're talking about. We talked about that there was this early Mishnah that they were making reference to. But the Gemara says, Martef, man dechar shmei. Where on earth did we come up with this wine cellar in the Mishnah? So they say, Hachi kamar, and we saw this today already, Kol makom she'en machnisim bo chametz ein tzarich b'dika. Just like, right, wine cellars, oil storage houses don't need bedika. It must be a place where they would go in the middle of their meal to get wine, and then you would have to check there. And that's where they start with this. Okay, we're going to have pictures today. The portal Daf Yomi started doing pictures now, which is nice. We'll see how often they do it. I'm just going to open it. Okay, so this will be helpful for us. So now we're going to see the Machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, and we're going to figure out what the issue is here. Beit Shammai Omrim, Shtei Shurot. So what did they say? Shtei Shurot al Penei Kol HaMartef. What does that mean? So debate. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Shtei Shurot Shamru Min Haaretz Ad Shmei Korah. From the floor to the ceiling, 2 rows. So you walk into the room, here's the door. You walk into the room and you see 1 row in front of you, another row, and then beyond those, right from the floor to the ceiling, beyond that, you don't have to go. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Shura Achat Kemin Gam, like the letter gamma, which they say is like a chaf sofit. Okay, it's like like the hay, like the part of the hay without the little thing. So it's when you walk in, a whole row in front of you, and from floor to ceiling, and a whole row from parallel to the ceiling. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yehuda, Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have a bright to support each reading. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yehuda, Beit Shammai, Omrim Shtei Shurot Opnei Kol HaMartef. V'shtei Shurot Shamru. Here's the wording of the Braita. The 2 rows they said, Min Haaretz V'ad Shmei Korah. Exactly what Rabbi Yehuda said, which is from the floor to the ceiling. Tanya Kavatei de Rabbi Yochanan, Shtei Shurot Opnei Kol HaMartef. Chitzona Ro'eh et HaPetach. The outer one sees the entranceway because it's that whole row. Ve'elyona ro'at hakorah, and the upper one sees the ceiling, meaning it's the whole area parallel to the ceiling. It's like an upside down L, right? But anything more into the room or more down, ein tzarich b'dika. All the rest don't need b'dika. That's what you see here. The browns are the ones that need checking, and the whites are the ones that don't. Now we're moving to Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel omrim shtei shurot chitzonot shehena elyonot. So the 2 outer ones, which are the upper ones. So that again is very confusing what that means. Amarav elyona v'shelamate mena means when you walk into the room, the first row that's near the ceiling, just right, not inward, just right there, the outer one, and the one below it. Ushmuel amar elyona v'shelifnim mena. The first row at the top and the one in, like go one further in. Again, just the 2 top rows, nothing underneath the top row. So my time of derav. Now notice, Beit Hillel says, chitzonot, outer ones, that are upper ones. So now they say, Rav said, chitzonot. He said, oh, we're dealing with outer. Outer is more important than upper. So they say, but ha'elyonot katani. But it says upper. So limiute tatai de tatya. It meant upper, meaning relatively speaking. The 2 upper ones, okay? Shmuel amar elyonah v'shelifnim hemena, the upper one and the one further in. My tama diek elyonot. He put the stress on the word elyon, the upper ones. So the upper ones are what's more important. And therefore, right, they say, but it said outer. So again, lemiute gavyata de gavyata. What he meant is outer compared to the inner ones. Okay, so the 2 outer ones that are at the top. Rabbi Chia, Tane Kavatei de Rav. Now it's interesting, they don't bring it, but they say Rabbi Chia has the exact version like Rav. And Kulu Tane Tanu Kavatei de Shmuel. But all the other Tanaim have the version of the Braita like Shmuel. And therefore, Hilchata Kavatei de Shmuel, we pass on like Shmuel, that it's the 2 upper ones at the top and then one further in. Okay, so we'll stop here. And there was a lot of food for thought. Again, I didn't do justice to this topic of Shulchan Mitzvah Ein Nizokin because it's Daf Yomi Shiur, but there's obviously a lot to be said about that and a lot of questions asked on that. But we'll end here for today. Have a great day.